The year is 1944. A Japanese infantry squad moves silently through the dense Philippine jungle, closing in on an American position. Their training has prepared them for everything: rifles, machine guns, grenades, even flamethrowers. What it has not prepared them for is the sound they are about to hear. A rapid series of mechanical clicks, followed by a noise their training manuals never described. Not a rifle, not a machine gun. Something they cannot immediately place. And then the world in front of them ceases to exist at close range. They have just encountered the M2 flamethrower, a weapon so psychologically and physically devastating that captured Japanese soldiers described it as something beyond the bounds of war itself. This is the story of how one American weapon fundamentally broke the will of Japanese forces in the Pacific, what made it so terrifying, and why its impact on the conflict has never been fully told. The M2 flamethrower entered American service in 1943, replacing the earlier and less reliable E1 and M1 models. It consisted of two cylindrical fuel tanks worn on the operator's back, connected by a hose to a handheld wand with a trigger mechanism. The system weighed approximately 68 pounds when fully loaded, roughly a third of the average Marine's body weight carried entirely on his back. The fuel mixture was the key to its effectiveness. Early models used a gasoline mixture that ignited and dispersed quickly. Later formulations incorporated napalm, a thickened fuel developed by Harvard chemists in 1942 that adhered to surfaces and burned for prolonged periods. Napalm did not simply set fire to a target. It clung to it. A direct hit meant fire that could not be extinguished by rolling or smothering. It followed a man into cover. It reached around corners. It flowed downhill into trenches and through ventilation gaps in bunkers. The M2 projected burning fuel to a range of approximately 40 to 60 yards, though combat operators often worked at much closer distances. At those ranges, accuracy was rarely required. To understand why the flamethrower became so critical in the Pacific, it is necessary to understand the defensive architecture Japanese forces had developed by 1943. After suffering devastating losses in open engagements at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Imperial Army commanders fundamentally changed their defensive doctrine. The new strategy centered on a system of interconnected caves, tunnels, and reinforced bunkers, positions that were largely impervious to artillery and naval gunfire. At Iwo Jima, engineers had spent months constructing over 1,500 rooms connected by more than 18 kilometers of tunnels. Some chambers sat 27 meters underground. The island had been transformed into a subterranean fortress designed to absorb American firepower while preserving Japanese fighting strength. Conventional weapons struggled enormously against these positions. Rifle fire and grenades could suppress the entrance to a cave, but could not reach the defenders inside. Artillery could collapse tunnel sections, but rarely penetrated deep enough to eliminate occupants. Even direct hits from naval shells, some weighing over a ton, failed to destroy the deepest fortifications. Marine commanders at Iwo Jima noted that positions believed destroyed through bombardment would often come back to life once the barrage lifted. The Japanese had essentially built a defensive system designed around the limitations of every weapon they expected Americans to bring. Into this tactical problem came the flamethrower, and it solved the problem in a way no other weapon could. Fire does not care about walls. It does not respect fortifications designed to deflect bullets and absorb shockwaves. It consumes oxygen. It creates heat that kills even without direct contact. And it does something that artillery and rifles cannot do. It follows the enemy wherever they have gone. Against a cave system, a flamethrower operator would approach the entrance under rifle cover from his squad, depress the trigger, and direct burning napalm into the opening. The fire would travel inward, following the natural airflow of the tunnel system. Defenders who had survived weeks of naval bombardment deep inside the rock would find themselves facing a weapon that rendered depth irrelevant. Marines at Iwo Jima used 27,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel across the 36-day battle. That figure represents thousands of individual cave-clearing operations, each one methodical, dangerous, and brutally effective. After-action reports from multiple Marine divisions document the flamethrower as the single most effective weapon for reducing fortified positions in volcanic terrain. The statistics from Iwo Jima are stark. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders on the island, roughly 18,000 were killed. Marine infantry attributed a significant portion of these casualties to flamethrower operations in the final reduction of cave and tunnel positions. The physical effectiveness of the flamethrower is well documented. What is less often discussed is its psychological impact on both the men who used it and the men who faced it. Japanese soldiers captured during Pacific operations and subjected to post-war interrogation spoke about the flamethrower in terms they reserved for no other American weapon. Officers who discussed American machine guns and artillery in tactical analytical language shifted to different vocabulary when the subject of flamethrowers arose. Words like dread appeared in translation, phrases that described the weapon as fundamentally outside the accepted order of combat. Several accounts describe Japanese soldiers abandoning defensive positions, something that otherwise almost never occurred when flamethrower teams were identified approaching their location. The Imperial Army, which had trained its soldiers to endure artillery, charge into machine gun fire, and resist surrender through a combination of ideology and discipline, had no psychological countermeasure for this weapon. Their doctrine could prepare a man to face a bullet. It could not prepare him for what the flamethrower represented. For American operators, the psychological burden ran in the opposite direction. Flamethrower operators suffered some of the highest casualty rates in Marine units. Their equipment made them visible targets, and they were required to operate at extremely close range. Veterans who carried the M2 rarely spoke about their experiences in later years. The nature of the weapon and what they had been required to do with it sat differently in memory than rifle fire. By 1945, American engineers had addressed one of the flamethrower's central limitations: the extreme vulnerability of its operators. The solution was the M4A3R3 Sherman tank, known among Marines as the Ronson or the Zippo, fitted with a hull-mounted flamethrower in place of its standard bow machine gun. The flame tank carried 290 gallons of napalm mixture, compared to the roughly 4 gallons in a man-portable M2. It could project sustained fire to a range of approximately 75 yards, and unlike an infantry operator, it was armored. Rifle fire, machine gun rounds, and most explosive fragments could not stop it. Japanese anti-tank weapons could, but deploying them required exposing crews to the combined fire of the tank's main gun and the supporting Marine infantry. At Iwo Jima, flame tank sections operated in close coordination with rifle platoons. The tactical sequence was refined to a systematic process. Infantry would identify and suppress a cave or bunker position. The flame tank would advance to effective range and deliver prolonged fire directly into the position. The tank could sustain this fire far longer than any infantry operator could maintain. Marine after-action reports specifically cite flame tank employment as decisive in accelerating the reduction of the Iwo Jima tunnel network in the battle's final 2 weeks. Without them, commanders estimated the island's complete reduction would have required additional weeks and substantially higher American casualties. By the time of the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, the integration of flamethrowers into American infantry tactics had reached its most refined form. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, together with Army infantry formations, faced a Japanese defensive network centered on the Shuri Line, a layered system of fortified ridges, reverse slope positions, and cave complexes that represented the most sophisticated defensive architecture of the Pacific War. The Japanese 32nd Army under General Mitsuru Ushijima had learned from every previous engagement. There would be no banzai charges, no defense of the beaches, no mass counterattack that American firepower could annihilate in the open. Instead, Ushijima's forces would make the Americans pay for every meter of ground. from fortified positions chosen to maximize the limitations of American weapons. What Iwo Jima's doctrine could not fully account for was the scale at which Americans now deployed fire. Marine and Army units at Okinawa operated with flamethrower sections fully integrated into every infantry battalion. Flame tank platoons moved in direct support of rifle companies. Coordination between infantry, armor, and flamethrower elements had become practiced, economical, and relentless. The reduction of the Shuri line took weeks of brutal fighting. When it finally broke, after weeks of attritional combat in rain-soaked terrain, the flamethrower had been present at every significant penetration. Caves that had held for days against artillery and rifle fire fell within hours once flamethrower teams reached their entrances. Unlike the contested history of some Pacific War weapons, the flamethrower's effectiveness is extensively documented in primary sources. Division after-action reports, operational research studies, and combat efficiency analyses all point in the same direction. The Operational Research Section, which conducted systematic weapon effectiveness studies throughout the war, produced detailed analyses of flamethrower employment that quantified casualty rates per position attacked, ammunition consumption, and time required to reduce fortified positions with and without flamethrowers. These studies concluded that flamethrower-supported assaults reduced fortified cave positions in a fraction of the time required by other methods, and at significantly lower cost in American casualties. Logistical records corroborate the scale of employment. The 27,000 gallons of fuel used at Iwo Jima were not a marginal supplement to the battle. They were central to its prosecution. Requisitions for napalm fuel mix, replacement tanks, and repair parts for flamethrower equipment appear constantly in division supply records. These are not the records of a peripheral weapon. Veteran accounts align with the official record. Eugene Sledge, whose memoir is considered one of the most authoritative personal accounts of Marine combat in the Pacific, describes flamethrower employment at Peleliu and Okinawa in specific, direct terms. He writes of positions that nothing else could touch being reduced only after flamethrower teams reached them. Other Marine veterans describe the weapon not as something they wanted to use, but as something they needed. No honest account of the flamethrower's role in the Pacific can avoid the human dimensions of what it meant in practice. For the men who carried and operated the M2, the casualty rate was among the highest of any infantry specialty. Identified as priority targets by Japanese forces, flamethrower operators were shot at the moment they were spotted. The equipment itself was dangerous. A punctured tank or a faulty seal could turn the operator into the target. Many did not survive the operations they were ordered to conduct. The men who operated flame tanks faced different but comparable dangers. Tanks operating at close range in broken terrain were vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and close assault by soldiers armed with explosives. The Iwo Jima terrain, with its gullies, ridges, and rock formations, often forced tanks into positions where flanking cover was difficult to maintain. Several flame tank crews were lost when their vehicles were immobilized and then attacked before infantry support could reach them. For Japanese defenders, the historical record from post-war interviews with survivors is consistent. The flamethrower represented a category of experience that their training and ideology had not equipped them to absorb. Soldiers who had maintained discipline under sustained artillery bombardment described their composure breaking under flamethrower attack in ways they found difficult to explain. The threat was not simply physical. It was something that bypassed whatever psychological preparation they had carried into combat. This is not offered as an argument that the weapon was somehow more brutal than others. War produces no clean casualties. It is offered as an explanation of why Japanese tactical responses to the flamethrower differed in character from their responses to other American weapons. The flamethrower's use in the Pacific had implications that extended beyond the battles where it was employed. American planners preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, allocated substantial flamethrower resources based on Pacific experience. Intelligence assessments of Japanese home defense preparations showed a defensive architecture modeled on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but on an incomparably larger scale. Hundreds of thousands of civilians had been organized into defense units. The tunnel and cave systems being prepared on Kyushu and Honshu made the Pacific Island fortifications look modest. Military planners concluded that conventional weapons, even combined with overwhelming artillery and air support, would be insufficient to reduce this defensive network within an acceptable time frame. The atomic bomb's use in August 1945 ended the war before these plans were tested, leaving the question of what a home islands campaign would have required unanswered. The flamethrower's legacy and military doctrine carried into Korea and Vietnam, where variants of the weapon continued to see use in terrain and against defensive positions with some similarity to the Pacific experience. In Korea, Marines again encountered fortified hill positions requiring close assault. In Vietnam, tunnel systems in some areas presented comparable challenges. Each conflict produced further evidence that the tactical problem the flamethrower had solved in the Pacific, fire that followed the enemy into prepared positions, did not disappear when the Pacific War ended. Modern militaries have largely transitioned to thermobaric weapons that achieve similar tactical effects through different chemical mechanisms. The tactical logic, however, remains identical to what Marine planners worked out in 1943 and 1944. When the enemy cannot be dislodged by projectiles, you change the nature of what you send in after them. The weapon that made Japanese soldiers beg for mercy was not the most technologically sophisticated weapon America brought to the Pacific. It was not the most expensive, the most modern, or the most celebrated. It was, in many ways, one of the oldest ideas in warfare: fire, carried in a backpack and directed by men who accepted enormous personal risk to employ it. What made it decisive was not the weapon itself, but the tactical problem it solved. Japanese defensive architecture in the Pacific had been constructed around the limitations of every weapon American planners had expected to use. The flamethrower was the answer to a question the fortifications could not handle. It did not need to penetrate concrete or deflect around rock. It simply needed to reach the air inside. The Marines who carried flamethrowers across the beaches of Peleliu, through the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and up the ridgelines of Okinawa, did so knowing they would be targeted first. Their contribution to the Pacific Campaign is documented in after-action reports, operational analyses, and the accounts of the men who served alongside them. It is a contribution that deserves more direct acknowledgement than the popular history of World War II typically provides. The Japanese infantry, hardened by years of combat and trained to endure almost anything, had not expected this. And unlike some surprises of the Pacific War, this one proved entirely decisive.